Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to webinar number 4 in the NCME webinar series, COVID's Impact on Assessments. Thank you for joining us. I see we've got a few more folks coming in from the waiting room, so we're going to give them time to come in and then get started. Okay, so again, welcome. This is NCME's webinar series on COVID's impact on assessments. This is webinar number 4 in the series, and it's Are We Ready for Remote Administration and Proctoring with K through 12 Students? I want to thank you all for joining us today. If you have been tuned into this series, you know we've had some great discussions so far. If you've missed any of the first 3 webinars in this series, they are available on the NCME YouTube channel. So make sure to check out those recordings. We also have plenty more coming up as we can go move our way through this series. So we hope that you are able to join us for those. When we were initially planning for this webinar series and thinking about this webinar in particular, we envisioned that a number of states would be planning for remote proctoring. We were thinking about all of the states, districts, schools, kiddos that were engaged in remote learning. And we really thought this is going to be kind of the most probably popular mode of test administration if we were looking ahead. But here we are a few months down the road and realizing that some states are considering this, but others have decided that they're not ready for it. So we started thinking about this and we're raising the question, well, are we ready for this? Is this something that we're ready for? We know that there was a recent survey by CCSSO that determined that 5 of the 39 states that responded indicated they would be using a remote administration option. But that left us with the idea that most would not be using it. So in today's webinar, we want to dive deeper into this topic and explore kind of how states are navigating this decision. So I'm your moderator for today. My name is Susan Davis Becker. I'm honored to be able to be a part of this great series and have this panel who's so kindly offered to engage in this discussion with us. My panelists include Jennifer Dugan from the Minnesota Department of Education, Vijay Samudrasam from Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, Jennifer Jedkins from the Maryland State Department of Education, and Ye Tong from Pearson. So we're going to start out by hearing some of the stories of the states, and we're going to hear about how they've gone through navigating this new time that we're all in, right? We don't want to say unprecedented times anymore. We're heading into 1 year into this. So it's no longer unprecedented. We're just now in the middle of it. We want to hear about how they thought about test administration for this spring and how they went about making the decisions that they did. We're also going to hear, Ye's going to provide one vendor perspective on are we ready for this and thinking about what the opportunities and challenges are with remote administration. And then we'll do some Q&A. I have a few questions planned, but I welcome you to add your questions to the chat at any time. Again, thank you all for being here and for being a part of this and contributing to this webinar. All right, we're going to dive right in here to hear the stories from the states. I'm going to ask each of my presenters to introduce themselves when they start to share their stories so you can learn a little bit more about them. Jennifer.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Dugan. I am the director for the Division of Statewide Student Assessment and Data Analytics at the Minnesota Department of Education. And so thanks so much for having me this afternoon. And it is definitely a strange time for sure, Susan. So if you want to go to the next slide so I can start talking about the assessments that we offer. Like everybody else, the nouns are just a little bit different, but we offer our academic or our standards-based accountability assessments, and then we also have our English language development accountability assessments. And so the formal names, the proper nouns are there. Minnesota does not offer anything in our assessment, our statewide assessment system, that is above and beyond the federal requirements. So we are grades 3 through 8 in reading, once in high school, 3 through 8 in math, once in high school, and then 5, 8 in high school science. Those are, and this is a bit important as I go through our options, those are all Minnesota developed content, Minnesota owned content, Minnesota constructed assessments. We own all of that content, and those assessments, additionally, another key piece there is that those assessments have been in place with the standards that we set in some cases since 2011, ranging all the way to 2014. So the youngest MCA that we have is from 2014. So those item banks have grown over time, which is a key factor in a part of this conversation. And then we also administer access and alternate access. And we are a member of the WIDA consortium. So with that, one of our key learnings was around definitions. So I'm going to try to model my lessons learned and talk about those definitions as I go through that. So in answering the question of what we considered and are we really ready for a remote administration, and how is that different from a remote proctored administration? And so when we are talking about in Minnesota, when we are saying remote proctored, or when I say during this presentation remote proctored assessment, I mean the administration is provided in a remote way, but it is monitored using technology. So there's video recording, there's audio recording, there's artifacts around that, and that can be investigated, looked at later, et cetera. So in proctoring, that looks very different from what we were referring to as remote administration. As we looked at that and moved down the road and looked at our options. So Vince, I think, although I don't want to stake my life on it, Vince, I think Minnesota was one of the ones on that CCSSO survey that indicated that we were exploring, and we are continuing to explore. But at that point in time, I think Minnesota was one of the ones that indicated that we were exploring. And so if that's helpful at all. So now you only have to sleuth out 4 more. So what we were looking at for this year's administration for remote administration was really thinking about a remote administration, not proctored, not securely administered, not available for additional investigation of, was there somebody else in the room? The computer was not going to be locked, would not be locked down, those kinds of things. So again, remote proctoring, that would be a secure administration. There would be video, et cetera. That was not what we're looking at. What we're looking at is remote administration, where it's not a secure administration. It's just giving that flexibility. So that was a key piece of those definitions, as well as what we also were finding was we needed to be really clear in with the combination of thinking about the assessment administration with the combination of our learning models. So in Minnesota, throughout the school year, districts have had the option of moving as appropriate based upon data and local decisions in and out of at a school, and in some cases at a grade level or a classroom level if they needed to, in and out of in-person learning, full in-person, full distance learning, or a hybrid, meaning that they were in person for some days and distance for others. And the amount of that varied by the location. And then another consideration as we were thinking about, another input to the decision-making process was that in Minnesota, an individual student or family has the option of opting into all distance learning regardless of the school's learning model. So the school could be in person or the school could be in hybrid, but an individual student or an individual family can, mostly by semester, choose to be in all distance. And so that was, continues to be something that we think about, and definitely an input, and again, to that CCSSO piece. So as I alluded to when I was talking through the assessment options, the options that were available to us were very different for our English language development standards assessments for access and alternate access, because again, we don't own that content. We're part of the consortia. We were part of that conversation. But once that decision was made, that was the decision that was made. Whereas in Minnesota, with us owning the content, we have very robust item banks. The assessments have been around for a while. And so we were able to have very different conversations for the two assessments. For our general assessment, which about approximately 98, 99% of our students take the MCAs. And so it looked very different. Our options looked very different for those two types. I've mentioned some of the inputs and some of the considerations, but additionally some that haven't come up as we continue to talk through. So I'm foreshadowing that we have not made a decision. But one of the conversations certainly is around accommodations. Our accommodations that are available in MCA in that remote administration are not the same accommodations that are available in person. And so thinking about that equity piece, thinking about, for example, MTAS, our alternate assessment, is not able to be given in a remote administration. So thinking about those accommodations, thinking about equity, thinking about also the testing conditions. So thinking about equity from the condition of testing of, we talk so much in the industry about, well, the environment needs to be quiet and they need to be able to focus. What would that look like in a remote administration way? Is there there would be no guarantee that a student would be able to be in a quiet environment and really focused on their assessment. And so thinking about that from an equity standpoint, as well as the technology side, we have so much in place around in-person assessments and testing out all of those systems and making sure that the technology works. And as we continue to think about that and what needs to happen for us to be sure that a student sitting at home can have those technology enhanced questions downloads in a satisfactory way to their system. And then also one of the other pieces is the changing of, again, those in-person learning model, or the learning models have changed over time with the situation of the pandemic. And so that's been a really big variable to anticipate where the number is going to be. So many of the decisions and planning and pieces, the strategy has so many unknowns of what percentage are going to be in which learning model at which point in time. And so those are some of our considerations and where we currently are at.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. Again, as I mentioned earlier, feel free to add any questions you have to the chat. As you can see there, we've got some conversations going. And I'm going to next turn to Viji. Tell us about yourself and then tell me when you're ready for your next slide.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Jennifer. That was so informative. So my name is Vijay Somasundram. I direct the Office of Educational Accountability with the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I am hearing that these sessions are a great hit, so hopefully ours will reach that mark as well. But anyway, I think I will add to Jennifer's saying that it's a unique year, is what I would say. So I think we can move on to the next slide with that. Yeah, ours is no different. We have the same cadre of assessments with different names here. We call the 3rd through 8th grade assessment as Wisconsin Forward Exam. And you can see the content areas that are assessed there. And then we also administer the alternate assessment, the DLM alternate assessment to our students with significant cognitive disabilities. So those two assessments meet both the federal and state testing requirements. Our state statutes include assessments at grade 3, 4, 9, 10, and 11. And so the 9th and 10th grade is a state-only requirement, and we administer ACT Aspire to meet that requirement. And we also administer ACT with writing for 11th graders, which meets both the federal and state testing requirements. So that's our assessments in a nutshell. So when it comes to the decision for whether we are going to administer or have a remote testing option, none of our vendors have offered us remote testing option for the spring. So we started this conversation way early. That option is not available for us. We do not own our test items. Those are the vendor-owned test items, so we don't have that opportunity at this time. So all our assessments have to be in person for this year. And when it comes to the learning modality, we have students who are in person, or schools who have students in hybrid model, or schools who have students completely in virtual model. So we have a combination of that going on in different ways, and sometimes schools go in and out of the in-person and virtual model as well. So in-person testing is what we have. That's the only option we have. But yeah, it presents itself with lots of challenges given there are students who are strictly in the virtual model. So we tried to work with our vendors to see what flexibilities we can create for our school districts to be able to administer the assessments. So for almost all of these assessments, we worked with the vendors to extend the test window so that if they want to bring in students, small number of students, and spread out the test, then they are able to do that. So usually we have a 6-week window. Now we are allowing an 8-week window. And this pandemic is a different time. So we are considering validity, but practicality also plays a big role here. And we also worked with our forward exam vendor to reduce the testing time. So we would not do that on any other year, but this year we've taken a look at our long write item and we've swapped that with a bunch of multiple choice items. Because when we took a look at our test times, our tests are untimed tests. We give an estimated test time. So when we take a look at the actual test times that students use to take the test, there is a huge variability when it comes to the long write. The item is estimated to take 45 minutes, but when we take a look at it, it's all over the board. It's 1 hour, 2 hours, sometimes they take even longer time. So we thought if schools have to plan for bringing kids in and out and to spread the testing and everything, it would be better to have a much better prediction. So that's why we are turning that item type off just for this year only. So in the future, we know the importance of writing. We will bring it back. So that's one change that we have introduced this year. We also have extended the online testing option for ACT for the first time. So with this option, there will be 18 testing day opportunities instead of the usual 3 test day opportunities. So we are also looking at even making the extended evening hours available in case, because most of the times we're hearing kids or with parents who are remote working. So it may be difficult for parents to bring the students to school, transportation purposes and all of that. So we're just open. We are meeting with our schools to see what are things that we can do to make it easy for us during this difficult time. So we're looking at evening hours, we're looking at weekend. So that's what we are trying to do. And we have worked very closely with our leadership staff, and we have been in continuous constant communication with school districts. We send a weekly digest communication to all our school districts on the updates, because since March last year, there have been changes and decisions and all these waiver conversations. So it's really important to keep them updated on what's going on, what are changes to expect and all of that. So we are working very closely with our schools. We are also learning that, some of the safety precautions like the mask mandates and things like that, there are certain students for whom masks may not work due to their own unique situations. So what do we do under that circumstances? Well, we have created a strategies document for schools to safely administer in-person testing, where we are recommending the use of masks, but we need to consider these situations where some of these steps and measures that we think are better may not be applicable for everyone. So we are really working closely to understand those situations, and some parents may not feel comfortable this year to send their students to school. So what may be things that we could do? So that's where we are at. But I also want to add to Jennifer's concerns about remote testing. So while the learning is happening remotely, testing is a whole different thing. Validity, administration-wise, we just don't know if we are there at. I don't know if I'm going to say that no to remote testing, because since last year there are so many changes we have made, and it's definitely something we have to explore. But at this time, we see some equity concerns in terms of standardized test environment, accessibility options, and test security and validity, and technology and all of that. So therefore we don't have that option, but we are keeping our eyes open, and we are going to learn from the superstar states who are going to pilot these things and see how it goes, and hope for a normal year next year. Thank you.
Thanks, Gigi. And yes, I think we all want to hear from those states who are able to move forward with this. So that's maybe the next webinar series. Okay. Oh, and I didn't click forward. So now we'd like to hear from Jennifer Jedkins from the Maryland Department of Education.
Hi there, I'm Jennifer Jedkins, and I'm the Assistant State Superintendent here in Maryland. I oversee assessment, accountability, and information technology, but a large part of my job is assessment and developing the new Maryland Comprehensive Assessment Program, or MCAP. And last year, so 1920, would have been our first year of administration for our new math and English language arts assessment. So it put us in a pretty interesting position that we didn't have a carryover test that had any items in an item bank where we could even possibly do a remote test. So I'll go ahead and I'll begin by sharing our testing system, and then I'll go into the considerations that we had when we explored remote administration. So here you can see, this is a snapshot of a one-pager that we put out for our state. We get a lot of questions from the local school systems about different assessments that they're seeing their kids taking, whether it's a parent or even some of the educators in the system. So we want to make it clear that from the state level, these are the assessments that we require. And of course, they meet federal accountability. We also have in social studies, a social studies 8 assessment. And once again, last year would have been its field test year. We're still figuring out if we're going to field test that this year. And then we also have a requirement statewide for our government. So we have the federal accountability assessments for math, ELA, and science, and then 2 additional social studies. And then like the other presenters, we are a part of some other consortiums. So we also have access, and our alternate assessment is DLM. And so in terms of remote assessments, DLM made the decision that we could not do that remotely, which makes sense. It's a very hands-on assessment, so we weren't able to do that. And then also for access, I think Jennifer talked about that. So we've covered our other assessments there. We additionally, we have a kindergarten readiness exam, which we did not administer this year, considering pretty much 100% of our districts were remote learning. So we weren't able to do that. Okay, go ahead, next slide. Thanks. So considerations for a remote administration. So our Maryland Integrated Science Assessment, or our MESA, you saw that on the previous slide, is an assessment that we've been administering for a few years. So of the assessments we could consider, clearly ELA and math were new, so we wouldn't be able to do those in a remote fashion because we wouldn't, not only did we not have stats on our new items, but we wouldn't be able to release any of those. We're moving both of those into computer adaptive. And so building up our bank of items is really important. And so the only one we really could consider at this point was our MESA, or a science assessment. And again, we had a very deep bank and we could afford to release an entire form. What we actually went back, just letting you kind of behind the door, is we were ready to release an entire new practice test. Like we were just on the verge of doing it. And then when we considered remote, we pulled that back and decided to use that as the assessment this year, since it was ready to go. And we could also release it since we were planning on releasing it anyway. And then the reasons that we did this is we figured that even if we could just take the pressure off the schools for at least one of our assessments, even just for 5 and 8 for that MESA, that would help, because we know that our other assessments would have to be in person. So we, again, considered this as the one that we might be able to provide. And at this time, one thing that we're up against is that most of our schools are fully virtual. We've had a push from our governor as well as our state superintendent for schools to be back by March 1st, at least in a hybrid fashion. So they are pushing towards that, but a lot of them are starting with the earlier grades. So you have kindergarten 1, 2 coming in maybe March 1st. But then again, like MESA, the first grade is 5th grade. So those kids may not even be in until mid-March or later, which is the case for most places. So our current window for our MESA is usually March 8th through the 26th, sometime in that March. And so what we're deciding to do is when we were trying to do the remote administration, we ended up we got the okay, then that got pulled back. So then we couldn't do it. So at this point, we're trying to extend our window past March 26th because a lot of those upper grade students in 5 and 8 won't be in schools yet. So we're going to extend hopefully through, our plan right now is April 30th. We're finalizing that. We'll announce that on Tuesday in our state. Okay, next slide. Okay. Thanks. So when we were planning the remote administration, our plan for this, because we're trying to figure out, well, how do we do this? We've got the kids at home. I have kids in school, so I'm watching my kids get on Zoom each day. And I actually watched my kids do the NWEA at home. They logged on with their teacher to their normal Zoom, and then they were also doing the NWEA at the same time, or MAPS. And so I could see that they could kind of be monitored. Of course, this wasn't completely secure, but it was a way, at least you had a teacher there. If you had some questions, things weren't going right. And believe me, many times there were shutdowns and we had to relog into the system. So there were times that you needed the teacher right there. But it was a way of kind of monitoring. So we kind of used that as our guide. And we wanted to have it, again, mirror the regular class time, because this is the teacher that the kids are typically with. And so there wasn't anything strange about it. You know, when I had watched my kids do that. So we're planning that same thing. So if they're going to take the science assessment, their science teacher would, get them online as they normally would be, and then administer the assessment. Some of the things that we were up against, though, is knowing, which happens probably to all of us a lot of the time, is that we have, we're running one program, we're running a conferencing, and then we're trying to run something else at the same time. It has issues with bandwidth. And so our vendor was Pearson. And we have a Pearson person talking after me, that we were going to do a little less security on it, so it wouldn't be completely locked down. Because for one thing, if we lock down the computer like we typically would at the school, they can't access any other websites. They could have a phone in their lap. They could have, their brother or their parent across the room. So there's a lot of other things we couldn't control. So it didn't seem to make sense that we would try to lock down the system. So we were going to leave that with a little bit less security. mainly just because we were trying to avoid any other issues that might come up. If it's too locked down, it's a little bit harder to get on if you get kicked off and so forth. So that was one of the things we were trying to do to remediate some of those issues. And okay, let's go to the next slide. I think I have more on that. So unfortunately, even with careful consideration and our explanation of the plans and the benefits, even the request from our local school systems to have a remote administration, as I said, our agent leadership initially supported it, and then we ended up going back on that. And then as I go through, there was my very last bullet, you can see here, I read that today as I was going through these, and I'm like, oh yeah, we considered it again. Honestly, I don't know where we're at with it. We go back and forth with this. Ultimately, at this point, we're not doing any remote administration. So we're just going to go ahead and just extend our window just to ensure we give enough time for the districts when they finally do return to school. The window doesn't end on March 26th, but we extend it past that. And then go ahead, next slide. I have a lot of slides compared to others. So when we, again, part of our consideration, because we were very solid on moving forward on this, so we had a lot of considerations there. And we were concerned about the data. That was probably our biggest one, is that what kind of data would we receive? And then the piece that we wanted to do, which I'm sure we've talked a lot about across a lot of these webinars and our different conferences, that we really hope to be able to remove the accountability piece from our assessments and just move assessments back to what they always were supposed to be, and that is information back to the classroom. So we figured if we could remove the accountability, and again, this part actually counts as part of our report card in the States. We have a STAR system, and the folks were really worried about that. So if we could remove that, we figured if we could just get kids to get on there, do the test as they would, not worry about what the score means, but really just provide information back for instructional purposes. That's what we were hoping. So we knew that we were going to have that, you know, it wasn't going to be completely secure, but we figured if you remove that piece and just let kids know why we're doing it, and teachers know, it's like, just do your best so that we know where everyone's at, and that can inform us instructionally. We were kind of hoping that we could, that would get us better results, at least, and folks wouldn't, you know, be inclined to cheat and try to do better for any reason. Just show us what you know so that we get that information back. And so at this time, again, I think we're at the point we're not administering anything remotely. We definitely went through a whole consideration. We set up our system to do it, and then we ended up having to back off from it. So I don't know if we're included in one of those 5 that was listed as remote instruction or remote administration. But one of the things we're up against is we're getting lots of questions because everything has to be done in person. We have not changed our assessments this year. And the reason that we haven't is that in the last 2 years, we shortened every assessment in the state. So what used to be, say, 270 minutes is now down to 160 minutes. We had our psychometricians weigh in. We went back and revised a lot of our blueprints to ensure that we could still measure what we needed, but then shorten those tests. So trying to shorten the test anymore, I was listening to VG, and I thought, oh, that's great. But yeah, we've already shortened about as far as we can go. So we're not going to make any more adjustments beyond that. But there still is a question because everyone has to come in person to take those assessments, and that's the only option. How do we go about doing this? So I've been trying to put together some different plans, and on our February state board meeting, I need to present some options and hopefully inform folks how we can still get this done, and really trying to come across with the kind of the intent that it's not that bad, really. It's just, 3 to 4 days for 2 hours. And so we'll see what we can come up with where it feels more doable for our folks, but that's where we're at in Maryland.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thanks.
Okay, so now we're going to hear from the vendor side, one vendor's perspective on where we are on this question.
Thank you, Susan. My name is Yeto. I am the Vice President of Psychometrics and Research Services with Pearson. So in this role, I oversee our psychometrics teams, both in the licensure certification exams, as well as the K-12 assessment programs. I am also the current NCME president, and it's great to see such interest attending our webinars. Very much appreciate it. And we have a few more coming up every Thursday until mid-March. So be sure to dial in and join us. So I will talk from the vendor's perspective because Pearson is a company that provides assessment services to states and districts. And I did check with a couple of other companies to make sure that I can reasonably represent from different providers what we're really thinking about if states are going to move to remote administration, et cetera. So I do appreciate all the feedback I got, and I'm going to try to incorporate all the different points I received. And as you can see in my title here, are we ready for remote administration? And Jennifer Jedkins from Minnesota has given us that definition. Like, we talk about remote administration or remote monitoring, but we're not talking about remote proctoring. And it's a very important distinction there. Remote proctoring in licensure certification exams, for example, if I want to be a teacher, I need to get my teacher certificate. Some states are allowing candidates to take the test remotely. And it's remote proctored. I have to register. And for my slotted time, I need to make sure to bring my ID to show the greeter that I am who I claim to be. And in some capacity or form, I have to do like a 360-degree scan of my room. And I'm going to be on video the entire time with a proctor somewhere in the world watching me, monitoring me, and the whole session will be recorded. And you also heard mention of the lockdown system and all that different things, so you don't have access to other things. That's a remote proctoring. So the technology capabilities are there, but is that something we can do with K-12 students? So that's a very different question. So there are a lot of opportunities and concerns for remote administration possibility with K-12. I was actually thinking earlier today, with this title for our webinar, a year ago, people will be going, are you nuts? Why are we even talking about it? The pandemic really pushed us in a variety of different ways. And this is one of the things we are actually really looking into very carefully. As you heard from the presenters before, many states have gone down that path and really explored the feasibility and really think about the challenges and concerns. So one concern, as I mentioned earlier, and many people before me, is the privacy law. We can't get away of doing that with K-12 kids. That's just not possible. The other concern people are also mentioning is the security. Once we have a remote administration of the test, can the content still be considered secure? Probably not. So we have to release all the items. Probably so. So that's another thing that people will have to really think about, especially if you don't have a very deep bank. The other side is the logistics, equity consideration. Do students have access to a device? Do they have access to stable internet? Now, one could argue access to device and stable internet should be a requirement for distance learning to begin with. So that issue hopefully is being addressed, actively being addressed. But what about the other side of the consideration? Some kids will be able to take the test in their own room in a very quiet setting where some other kids may not have the resources and access. So it is a very complex issue. Now, with opportunities, it does provide the flexibility we need, especially during a pandemic. We are meeting where students are essentially. They are learning remotely, so we could argue they can be tested remotely as well, because that's how they're learning. And of course, all of us are concerned about COVID learning loss, and we want to measure that loss. Identify which areas are being hit the hardest, which areas are still okay. And we want to be able to allocate some targeted resources. Without that level of data, it's very hard to do. So there are opportunities and concerns with this particular topic we're talking about today. Now, Andrew Ho did mention in the chat about what about accountability? What about low stakes versus high stakes? So personally, and I'm not sure if I'm representing Pearson or representing the other vendors here, but personally, I do think this year, the assessment, the accountability measure should be relaxed. we should not use the results from an assessment this year to really think about rank ordering of schools or evaluation of teachers. However, it is important to have a pulse check on where kids are. We all think there's learning loss, but how much, with whom, and where? So these are really important questions. I have a 5th grader, and I would like to know if Justin is still doing as well as he did from 2 years ago, or doing as poorly as he did from 2 years ago. So going on to the next slide. So in the next scenario, I'm going to talk a little bit about, so you have heard from that CCSSO survey, there are 5 states back in December were considering remote testing as an option. Now, a month has passed, and we all know the month is very long right now, and a lot could have happened during that time. But I'm going to play out a scenario where if a state is going to embrace the remote administration option, and they are going to have the option here where they're going to allow in-person testing for the students who are in classrooms, and they're also going to allow for remote testing for the students who are actually doing remote learning full time. So what will be some of the critical questions that we should ask, and what are our responses to that? So first of all, the equity issue is huge. We want to make sure from device and internet access perspective, students have the access. So we can say, yes, we'll assume that's how they're learning, so they should be okay, but maybe that's not good enough. Now, from a consideration around the test administration, or should the test be proctored? Jennifer Dugan mentioned earlier, when they were exploring the different options, as they are exploring different options, they were talking about, could we think about Zoom sessions? Oh, I think it might be Jennifer Jedkins. Sorry, the 2 Jennifers. But they were talking about, well, could we have Zoom sessions and have the teachers being there together with the students? So there is no way we can have a proctor somewhere that are not connected to the students at all. But what about their classroom teachers? Can we have a Zoom session where the teacher is monitoring the students as they take the test, and also be able to provide support if they have any difficulty navigating through the tests? Would that be okay? So we have, for Pearson and also for some of the other companies I've talked to, I think this option has been explored quite a bit, because this is how students were learning, and maybe this is how students could be tested too. And so there's that logic link there. Another question is, should the test include both operational and field test items if we are doing remote administration? And my simple answer there is, I would not want to, if I can help it, I would not want to do field testing within the remote administration condition. Now, some states may not have that option. Maybe they will need to field test within remote administration because their bank is not quite there yet, and really hoping to be able to build up a bank for the next year's assessments. We all have different challenges we have to deal with. If that's the case, if you want to field test, try not to use the statistics as much from those field test conditions. Do post-equating, when these items actually go operational. Should remote test items be released? So we talked about security quite a bit, and I think Jennifer from Maryland also talked about, well, we're going to do this for our science test. When we were considering it, we were going also to consider that test, and then it's fully released. I think a lot of people are concerned about the security, and this is why we don't really want to do field testing within the remote administration. So I think, yes, there have always been a lot of requests from the field about release items, and so this will be an opportunity for the state to be able to showcase what the tests look like, and etc. Now, if you have a test that is computer adaptive at the student level, in-person administration, do you want to do computer adaptive testing in the remote administration? Now, I have a simple answer for that one too, but you may not agree with me. I do not think you should, because again, going back to the security concern, do we want to just not one form, but put our item bank kind of at the security risk when you also want to do a computer adaptive test for the remote administration? We have talked to quite a few different states thinking about this issue. And one possible solution that has been talked about quite a bit is the just create a linear form. It could be a little bit longer than the actual computer adaptive test if you're really worried about measurement precision, or it could be just the same blueprints, but use a linear form and treat it as insecure once the test is over. Pre-equating versus post-equating. We had an equating session about 2 weeks ago where we talked about, should we do pre-equating or should we do post-equating? My personal opinion is, if we have good faith in the field test parameters we've collected from before, I would really want to push for pre-equating this year, provided you have confidence in the statistics you have on those field test items. Now, when we do equating, from the literature, from experiences, we have seen cases where if your two testing populations taking the two different forms you're trying to equate, if the two testing populations are very different from each other, it's going to impact the quality of equating. When the differences is large, it will inadvertently impact the equating results. So if we believe there is COVID learning loss and we are concerned about that aspect, then the two testing populations from 2021 and from 2019 are going to be very different. So if to the extent possible, pre-equating might be the way to go. Same thing for remote administration. The testing condition now itself is actually very different. So I would argue for pre-equating in that regard. Reporting, that's a big thing too when you have remote administration and in-person. So should we pull the results from in-person administration and remote administration? Should we pull the results together and report as one? So how a school is performing, how a district is performing, we're just going to pull the two testing conditions together. Should we do that? My personal belief, again, I don't think we should. I think we should really think about separating the two. I think we ought to evaluate, do some quote unquote comparability, so to speak, between the two types of testing conditions. Once the data are back, we should do all these comparability analysis, but I would be more leaning towards reporting separately, just because the testing conditions are very different and how it's being implemented for a given district, for a given school, or for a given classroom could potentially be a little different. But at the same time, I think if a state is allowing both options, a lot of instructions should also be put in to really help guide people along. Now, follow-up analysis, I'm really looking forward to be able to do some of those follow-up analysis, because this year the data are very interesting and unique. And we have collected a lot of different types of data that we were not doing before. For example, the learning model, like, are you fully in person? Are you fully remote? Are you hybrid learning? And some states even collect engagement type of rating. How many days are you learning in person? How many days are you learning remotely, et cetera, et cetera. I think that would really help us do some of the follow-up analysis to see different learning models to really help a district or help the state overall to look at what has worked, what has not worked, where should we really target our resources in the future. The pandemic will be over, and I hopefully very soon, but the impact from the pandemic could be here to stay for a little bit longer than we would like. And I think the sooner we can have some data to help us, yes, the data are not perfect, but if we can have some data to help us to really think about, to really digest, to get some interpretations, to really think about what are the ways we can help the students continue to be able to get over this hump would be really good. So, so those are the questions I came up with, and I see a lot of different questions in the chats too. I do want to take this opportunity and thank Steve Fitzpatrick, Jen Beimer, Sarah Kyson, and Mark Julian for all the brainstorming sessions they had with me. Thank you.
There we go. Sorry, Zoom didn't want to let me off unmute. Thank you to all of our presenters. This was great. And yeah, I think you were getting some traction with some of your questions and ideas in there with some of the comments. So thanks to everyone who's joining in the conversation. Okay, so again, keep adding your questions to the chat. I've noted a few of them down. I've got a few questions I want to ask of our panelists, and then we'll dive into some of the Q&A that's come in. So to start off, what do you see as the major equity challenges with your current administration plan? I mean, we're going into this in a very strange year, as you all have noted. So what are those biggest challenges? And I'm going to start, Jennifer Dugan, you mentioned equity. So I'm going to start with.
Oh, by the way.
There we go. Jennifer Dugan, I'm going to ask you to start with this one.
Okay. So I struggled with this one a little bit. And I'm not going to make it specifically about the remote administration, but it is certainly my biggest concern right now with our current plan is that we don't have a plan. And so that is leaving our districts in a place of uncertainty. And I guess in one place that means that it's equitable because we're all in a place of uncertainty and nobody's getting the jump on preparation. But right now, that is my greatest concern is that it is, as you mentioned, it's February and we don't know which administration approach we are going to use this year. And that is concerning. And so I would say that's probably my biggest concern right now. And realizing that. And I would also say there have been a few questions about equity and data in the chat, and certainly as we have thought about what are those pros and cons, and do we go with that remote administration, all of those variables, and making sure that it does work for the student, and thinking about all of the protocols that we have in place in the district do not easily translate to a remote administration in the way that again, that we were defining remote administration for this specific given school year in Minnesota. So just really thinking about, again, we do want to be sure that somebody mentioned the technology divide, and it is a huge concern that there's a technology divide generally speaking throughout the state, but then we're hearing even with distance learning, there's entire apartment buildings that don't have the devices aren't working and they don't have internet connection. And so thinking about, again, all of those protocols that we have in place for that remote administration for equity is certainly at the center of that, thinking about those accommodations, thinking about the administration going smoothly. The remote administration piece that we're thinking about, all of the security essentially is turned off so that the administration is as smooth as possible. The student can re-enter if they're getting kicked out, and it doesn't work on that way. That is, we'll see where it lands, but right now my biggest concern is that, and again, we've mentioned it, I can firmly say I have never been in a place where in February I did not know what assessment we were administering a month from now. So this is definitely that's one of my greatest challenges and concerns right now.
Sure. So kind of just getting everything ready once you finally do have that plan of all those pieces that you normally have ready to ensure or to increase equity across the groups.
Yeah.
Okay. Vizi, how about you? What are your biggest equity concerns based on the plan you described?
I think the learning modality being all over the board at this time, with some students in virtual models, some students in hybrid models, some students in in-person model, and then schools going in and out, makes me worry about the plans that schools have to make to test, and then the comfort level for parents to send their kids to school. Also, another thing is some of the schools who are going into the in-person model this semester or later in spring, okay, they have been missing all those in-person instruction all this time. So when they come back in the last 2 months, are they going to spend the time in testing? So, and we have, yes, we will have valuable data because of the disproportional impact that the pandemic may have on students. At the same time, students' socioeconomic situation have changed. There have been some concerns about mental health. So I'm just thinking about all of those things, and it's just really worrisome to me this year. So.
Sure. Okay, Jennifer Jedkins, you talked a lot about kind of sitting on this fence and going back and forth between remote administration and in person. So how do your equity questions change as you think about both modes?
Right. So I was actually thinking, I was like, do I feel better or worse about our plan? After Jennifer spoke, I was like, we have a plan. I'm not sure that I'm thrilled with it because we're getting so much pushback from our local systems. But our plan at this point is that everybody must take every assessment in person. And so that's our plan. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a huge push in our state to get kids back in the classroom. As our superintendent keeps saying that she's just getting hundreds upon hundreds of letters and videos of, parents who want their kids back in the classrooms, and that's what we need. And so, but we know at the same time that not everyone's going to go back. We've heard plenty of that on the other side, that my kids are going to stay home fully remote. So I think our greatest challenge at this point, and I don't know if you want to call it, I guess it's an equity issue, but people judge that equity on from different fronts here. That is it equitable that they don't get to take the test, or they don't have an opportunity to take the test? And that's kind of what we're up against right now, is the students who do come in for in-person will have the opportunity to take the test. And then the students who are fully remote, they have the opportunity to come in, but whether they take that or not, I'm not sure. And we don't have an opt-out policy in our state. So if they choose not to come in, they're basically just a non-participant. So that being the greatest challenge is that everybody must take the assessments in person, and very doubtful we're getting all or even most of our kids in to do that. So we shall see how this plays out.
Good. Yeah, what about you from a vendor perspective? Where do you see the biggest challenges?
Well, first of all, fingers crossed for everything this year. It's just been challenging all over the place. So in terms of equity, from our various conversations and our experiences, so one thing I do want to point out is, and we've heard our presenters mention earlier too, we are like remote administration. If when we're talking about, we're really just talking about gen ed students, right? We know for ELL students, it can be a huge challenge, as well as the students with disabilities. And we do not have remote administration possibilities for a lot of those assessments. From that CSSO survey, in that summary, I think the majority of the states, if I remember the number correctly, 31 out of 39 were saying they will test students in person. And if I have a student on an IEP at home, and if we're doing full remote learning, it's going to be a very big argument for me to bring my kids in for in-person testing, as much as I advocate for testing. The other thing I will challenge people a little bit too on this. So we talk about equity in the sense of whether people have access to devices, access to internet, whether they have a quiet place to take the test. What about the option to take the test? What if I have a remote learning full person, a kid at home, and I want him to take a test? Would that be considered equity? So that would be a challenge for the audience.
Thanks. There's been some great comments and questions in the chat about comparability or combining scores between different administration conditions. And I think what's interesting is that our presenters have talked about, even if thinking it's all got to be in-person administration, still very different conditions if you're coming in on a Saturday because you're a remote learner, or how is this going to work? So I think that's a good lead into our next question of, within your current plan, what do you see as the biggest challenges for interpreting test scores and using them to inform instruction or really kind of make meaning out of those scores? So Vijay, I'll start with you on this one.
As you know, our only option is in person at this time, but it depends upon what the participation is going to be, and even for the students who start the test, how far they will be able to complete it. And then the whole learning, that the different mode of learning that has been going on for students over the past year, and how comparable the data would be, and what stories it would provide us, because we're only thinking about the learning, the mode, but there is also so much thing that's happening with so many people infected and so much lives lost, and there would be impact of those for some of our students, and how would that all play out, and how can we control for those variables that we may not have a good idea about, right? So I don't know still I want to echo one of the presenters here, where it's an opportunity for the students who are in person, so for them to give the assessment, because they are coming in person, most of them are there, and if they want to take the test, that will give a good enough data, because even if they are in person, a lot of them are in hybrid model with 2 days of school and 5 days of asynchronous learning, and some jokes that as a 5-day weekend, and are we setting them up for the college readiness? Or are they going to take forever to complete college courses because now they are used to only work for 2 days? Are they going to take classes like that, and all of that? So there is just a lot of variance here, but at the same time, any data is good data. We will have some information that comes out of it. And without data, there will be no stories, there will be no conclusion, no inferences, but we would have some inferences. But I think it will take a lot more years. Sometimes I hear conversations that allude to the fact that, okay, this is a 1-year thing, let's get back to normal. It will take some time for us to get back to normal. And that's why I look up to the great folks here to see what kind of analysis they can conduct for us, what kind of opportunity to learning type of thing that we can provide, what kind of deep diving can we do here to address the learning gaps that we might have seen during this time. So I see my name that just flying all over. Thank you, Scott Marian, with your humble disagreement. But I saw my name in another place which flew, so I didn't know. So maybe when another person talks, I will look and I will come back.
Okay. And I think that's a good point that you're making, that this isn't just 1 year. It's not a 1-year question on data interpretation, but it will be with us for probably multiple years. And I think it's great. Okay, Jennifer Jedkins, would you like to weigh in here? What do you see are the biggest challenges for interpreting data?
Sure. It's when Vijay said it's good data, or, the data is good. I was like, yeah, that's true, right? Because we want to know what's happening with our kids. It's going to tell us something. And then, of course, Scott Miriam weighs in. I'm like, oh no, now he thinks it's bad. That's okay. We can have our different thoughts. But I was seeing the same thing, that we need some data to look at what's happening with our kids. So to me, it's good data. Sorry, Scott. We'll just disagree on that one for right now. Don't listen to Scott. Love it. So I have to stop reading the chat. So our biggest challenge for us is the thing that we've been talking about just endlessly in our meetings. And it's more to do with the fact that this is our first year of administration of our new assessments. And oh my goodness, are we going to set our IRT scale using this data this year? And what do we do about that? And we're reporting scores. And those are the challenges that we see. This is like the ultimate worst year to do a new test and to gather your data for setting your scale. Obviously, we're going to revisit it in 22, but that's the challenge that we're up against. And additionally, we don't know what sort of spread we're going to get from our state. Is it going to be representative of our students? And so we're trying to figure out, can we take so sorry, not so much related to the instructional piece, but just in general, what we're going to use our data for is, what are we going to be able to tell future wise for our assessment. So for me, that's honestly just at the top of my mind is the biggest challenge is that we have a new assessment and we're doing standard setting this summer, and we've got to see what that data is telling us. But overall, I think I want some data back. And so that's going to tell us something about our kids. So for me, it's good to hear back and see what's happening, because we can compare, how our students did 2 years ago. So yeah.
Great.
Yeah. And as a parent, I want to see how my fifth grader is doing, really. I mean, I think a lot of parents probably want to see, we're all talking about COVID learning loss. How much did we lose? I think that just to be able to quantify or have some sense of it would be really, really helpful. But as VG was mentioning earlier, there will be a lot of variances in the data. We will have to do some deep dig into the data to be able to think about the different various purposes going to be used. But I'm excited to be able to get our hands on these data and be able to do some research. As a measurement professional, I think a lot of us are very, very looking forward to that. But one thing I want to, but it's going to be challenging. But one thing I was going to bring up too is we also are working with the state customer. They're thinking about rolling out some summer learning programs, learning camps. And what they were hoping to do is to use summative assessment results to help them inform, because it's a statewide program, only summative assessment. It's really, the summative assessment is the only one the whole entire state will be taking. And they're hoping to be able to use the summative results to identify kids to be able to enroll in the summer learning camps and be able to really address some of those COVID learning losses. And so I'm giving you an example of how some of the results can be used and in a very good way. Yes, we're going to have a lot of challenges comparing this year's results from 2 years ago in 2019. But within the year, there will be a lot of comparisons we can also do, as well as across years. We have, as professionals in measurement, we have to put our heads together and really figure it out. Talk to your tax, talk to your measurements and providers to be able to really think deep into the various analysis that we could do.
Great. Jennifer Dugan, what about you? What are your what do you see as the biggest challenges with interpreting test scores?
Thanks. So I think a bit of my answer here also ties into the equity piece. And so as we continue to have the conversation about whether remote is appropriate or not, I've talked about, we have a variety of learning modes going on, and we want to be sure that we are capturing as much information as we possibly can. And we're hearing that, several of the students, it is not uncommon for the students that are participating in full distance learning by choice, not necessarily because of that's their school or district learning model, but by choice for those students. Again, we don't want to lose them from the data. And so that equity piece, but it also leads into interpreting the scores. And then that, as the chat has been, chatting about, obviously we're not talking about combining. And so that piece is a really big consideration in the assessment reporting piece. I would also say the chat's been talking a lot about the appropriateness of the data and all those pieces. And Andrew, to your point of data are never good nor bad, I think that goes a bit to the importance of data literacy. And I think that like no other time in our history is it more critical for the general public to have data literacy and to really be able to ask the right questions or understand that data is missing as they're looking at the scores. So we want to be sure that interpretation is sound and in keeping with the why, back to that piece. And I think, we've kind of touched on it a little bit, but I think it's that we're hearing a lot of, again, to the data literacy piece, we're hearing a lot of concerns about, well, the assessment isn't valid because learning has been impacted. And so how do we get ahead of that messaging? And at this point, I don't think I can get ahead of it anymore, but how do we really inform the public that we may not like, we may not love or readily want to embrace whatever these results show, but they are based off of assessments that started off being reliable measures of content. And so building that confidence and that data literacy is critical.
That's a great point, and I think you're getting a lot of support for that notion of thinking about that, how this can extend into that other purpose this year. So I think we could probably keep going down this path, but I want to kind of circle back towards this question of remote administration, and think about for your state, what do you believe is needed for remote administration to work in the future? You know, maybe this year was just too crazy, too quick, too many things in flux for it to be right. But what would this year, or what would we need in the future? And Jennifer Jedkins, I'll ask you to start here.
I mean, I like the idea of remote administration, and I'd like to consider some things for the future. I feel like we'd have to do it in steps. Like we'd have to take, again, like one of our assessments and see what we could do with that. Maybe a less high stakes one. All of them are, but I think that MISA one was a great one for us to start with. Maybe somewhere down the line we can bring it back and say, hey, let's try it this year and do at least, some remote. And I know there was a lot in the chat about comparing the data from a remote administration compared to in person. I think that was my thought when we started discussing that. I was like, why don't we compare to the data instead of, I don't want to put it all together, we keep it separate, but then we can do, some sort of comparison to see how students did. But I think it's something that we can continue to consider because who knows what's going to happen in the future. It'd be nice to actually, give it a little bit more deeper thought so that we might be able to put something in place. I was really disappointed we ended up not going down that path. I would have loved to see what we might have gotten from it, because I think it would have given us a lot of information to, base some future decisions on. So I think it's something we would still continue to explore. But I don't know how quickly we come back to bringing it in. I think we're all just trying to get back to a normal year, and then, but we'll continue conversations around it and see, because I think there's certainly some possibilities, and we've come up with a lot of challenges and things that we need to consider, mainly the security of it. But as we get, better and better, the kids are so used to being on camera at this point. I mean, we have to watch out for just safety issues. But again, if it's their teacher they're already on with, that's about as safe as we can get. So I think those are things that we'll consider as we move forward.
Great. Jennifer Dugan, I'll ask you to weigh in next. What do you think would be needed for you to feel comfortable with remote test administration? What do we need to learn or do better?
I think, Susan, I think you touched on a really key part of it, and it goes to early transparent and robust communication, because all of that plan has to be in place, that robust communication plan to ensure transparency so that everybody can understand the appropriate use. We can get to that place of being data literate, and they can understand, okay, this is less than ideal, but it's still appropriate in this specific context, and all of those pieces. And so I think it goes back to the data literacy, but it also goes back to starting much before February the 4th for a March administration. And the other piece, and someone also put this in the chat that I think we've all alluded to and may just be an automatic, but the data privacy piece has got to be, and that goes to the transparency piece of the upfront communication around that transparency and that communication. We've got to really be clear. We've got to have people's trust that when we are recording people, especially students, that we know how to treat that respectfully and appropriately. And so I think that's what we would need.
Mm-hmm. Great. Viji, what about you? I know
Yeah.
you mentioned the vendors would need to be on your side for that one, but
Yeah, I'm thinking that even though for states for whom they do not own their items or they do not have a deeper item bank or something, but um, this is a unique year. This situation is impacting every state. It's not like one state's problem, but a number of these vendors are also servicing several states. So can they come into agreement to release some items for this unique year? So that's something that I would I would look forward to see happening. But even with remote testing, I think it's really important for folks to understand the use of data at the end. It may be okay to draw some summary type of conclusions, but individual student level, I am not sure, because there are times that decisions are being taken where the summative scores are factored in terms of advanced placements and various other decisions. So, care should be taken because test security could be an issue. And again, when a teacher does a Zoom session with 20 or 30 students, the teacher is the one who's streaming. And I see lots of students saying, I want to turn my camera off, right? It's more of their, at their discretion because they don't feel comfortable, right? They're okay when they're in person, but they don't feel comfortable turning their camera on. We have various age groups here. So all of that has to be taken into consideration. But some research on this area to see what is the potential we have. I'm really concerned about our very young students, but at least for high school, and for upper middle grade, I think maybe we can start researching in that area to see how we can look into these aspects.
sounds good. And yeah, since you're speaking for all vendors here, what do the vendors need to do to kind of better support this initiative, or where do you think the vendors are going to go with this availability?
Well, thanks for putting me on the spot. Before I dive into it, I really love the webinar. The chat feature I felt like it was like a third dimension we're introducing to the presentation. So thank you all in the audience who are shooting us all these questions or comments and things like that. I really appreciate that. So I mentioned the licensure certification exams and the online proctoring process earlier in the presentation. And before the pandemic, we didn't really have a lot of volume in our online proctored exams for Pearson. And I think that's true for a lot of other providers. But since the pandemic started, we just see those numbers skyrocketing. And so what would happen to remote administration possibility for K-12? And part of me wonders, about 10 years ago, we talked about moving from assessment from paper to online. And that was a big deal back then. So 10 years from now, right, are we going to will remote administration, remote proctoring be just a mundane set of testing conditions that we would offer for K-12 students? I'm very much looking forward to it. It's good that we're recording this session. 10 years later, we'll come back and check and see what happens. And we also have those online schools. So there is really a need for assessment to go online, to be remote administered. My technology person is also on the call and he's been privately chatting me and he's like, well, we can measure. So from a capability standpoint, he was telling me we can measure a lot of the different things. So with advance of technology, we can measure how students are taking the test. We can collect a lot of data, how much time they're spending on the item, where their cursors are, all these different types of data. And then we can compare those data with tens and thousands of other students who are taking the test in an in-person condition and be able to use that information to come up with, do we trust the testing behavior or do we not? So there's a lot of technology side of things that we could do. So I am optimistic, but 10 years from now, we'll come back and revisit.
All right, and there's some support in the chat that you'll be right in 10 years, so we can put some money on that. I agree with you on the chat. I want to thank everyone for contributing their thoughts and comments and for some of the responses. I think this has been really great. And I don't know if I've kept up with every question that's been to determine if it's been answered or unanswered, but I'm seeing a lot where folks are saying, hey, regardless of mode, we're going to have variation in administration, whether it's remote versus in person, or in a classroom versus a special administration for a student who's normally learning at home, whether it's they're coming back to school. I think Jennifer Jedkins described this fear that they'll finally get back in school and they'll be taking tests, or I think Vijay, you were thinking the same thing. So you've been learning at home all year and all of a sudden you come back and you're sitting in a classroom taking a test. And we're going to have variation, it sounds like, no matter what state we're talking about here. And I think some of the more recent comments are saying, hey, not only how do we look at that, but how quickly can we use this data, but proceed with caution, which of course is very important. So I'm curious I'm curious from my panel's thoughts on how should we proceed with what are your biggest cautions about looking at this data? What are your your most urgent needs to use the data? How are you kind of balancing those demands that you're probably going to be facing? So I will start with Jennifer Dugan. Do you want to jump in there?
I have a lot. How do I pick just one? I think we all have a ton. And not dissimilar from the theme of the chat, in some ways, I hope we're able to capitalize on, take advantage of the fact that folks are listening, that they are concerned, that they are hesitant to just accept the scores. I'm sure this only happens in Minnesota, but the day that the statewide summative scores are released, it is a big news story, and the newspapers across the state report just the numbers and report the deltas in just number form. And I really hope that we can take this time to really talk about what those numbers represent in terms of, and this goes into the analysis, but in terms of student learning, and we can really bring it back to the standards, and we can talk about, as somebody else put in the chat, everybody has a ton of data. These assessments are one data point in what is hopefully a very healthy and comprehensive district or local assessment system. And so I would hope that we could take this time to kind of bring it back to the root intent, to Jennifer's earlier point of, hopefully we can use this time to kind of release the pressure, so to speak, for accountability and that misuse, and really get back to the instruction and the meaningfulness and appropriateness within the greater context of education.
Great, thanks. Vijay, what are your thoughts there?
Of course, I think I saw Andrew was cautiously optimistic. Yeah, I am. I'm joining you in that low island. I think data literacy is something that states should focus, which we have been focusing for several years, but now it takes a different toll this year, especially because, as Jennifer mentions, there is so much hunger for data. And sometimes I see things on the news articles and there's so much misunderstanding and being represented in various news articles, and then the consumers may not have as much information, and that leads to various unintended interpretations as well. So I think the more messaging that could happen this year in terms of how or what are the appropriate uses of data. And I do not know why I hear so many say that this year we are going to think about a little a and not a big A accountability, but there's no big call yet, right? And states like us, we have a federal accountability system, we have a statewide accountability system, and we're just trying to plan for what this year, because as long as the legal requirements remain, we are expected to fulfill all those requirements, right? So what to prepare for, how to prepare for it, and what to expect, and what is meaningful for our students and parents and our educational stakeholders this year is a big theme. I think should come together to discuss and see what are certain resources and how can we roll these resources out to help people use this data appropriately. And if we report the data, we know what it is intended to do and what we want it to do, and no matter how many resources we put, is that how it's going to be interpreted. And our accountability for many of the states, it's not just 1 year. And a number of these data points are going to be used, in a 3-year period and all of that. And last year we all didn't have data, so are we going to do a skip year growth if we have to do report cards this year? So there's just so much going on in my mind. I'm just constantly watching what resources are coming and what would be meaningful this year, and how would we navigate this piece between the reasonableness, meaningfulness versus the compliance piece. So that's where I am.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Jennifer Jedkins.
Can you give the question again? Because now I'm just lost in what everyone else.
Yeah, we've kind of talked through a lot there. So we were talking about kind of some themes from the chat are we really need to scrutinize this data and think about what it means, because there's so many possibilities of variable factors that going to be impacting how students are going to do on these tests. And even the sample, as some have brought up, like who is even the sample that takes the test? How are you going to balance that with probably the demand for, we need to know this information, we need it so we can use it, so we can plan?
Right. Well, I had mentioned that, we were looking at trying to get that representative sample. I think that I'm still very fearful of what is going to come out. And, not just in, representatively who is going to actually come in and take the test, but also, there's so many different factors as have been mentioned in the chat as to how it's going to affect the data. It's not just, oh, well, they just had at-home instruction. Did they have access to a computer? Did they, we have some students who apparently are still doing packets in the state. That's not okay. So there's a lot of different things that are impacting instruction right now. And so, yeah, what do you do with that data? I think the greatest thing we can do is say, okay, well, let's just take that. And we're going to see a lot of gaps likely, right? And just like we would on any other year, we need to actually address those. Like we need to go in and say, here are, areas that we really need to focus on. These are things that we missed. I would hope that you would look at your students from the previous year and see what are we seeing as gaps. Even if it's not every student, you should have some representation of some of those students and you can see where there were lags. And let's just make sure that we're also addressing that and rolling into the instruction that we're doing upcoming. It certainly isn't a year to ignore. And then, on the higher level, I was in another webinar yesterday about reading, and the superintendent who was speaking was saying that, I really need the stat data because I need to see where I need to shuttle funds. I need to see where there are gaps. I need to see where we can support. And that is true at the state level. And we're, the majority of us here are state level, and we need that information. What do we base it on? If we only have local data, it's kind of hard to know that because it's not necessarily comparable, between district to district. We have something that's state level, at least we can see that it's the same, comparable data from one district to another, and we can start, shuttling resources. So I would hope that we would still really use this data and if nothing else, tell a bit of the story. And someone, I think VG said something about skip year growth. Absolutely, that's exactly what we're doing. And it's very reasonable to be able to do that. So I hope that we are looking at it and that we dig down as much as we can and look at the specifics of where we need to address things in the classroom as well as state level.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, what would be your advice for groups thinking about this question?
Oh, I'm gonna try to be brief. This is just very exciting session. I felt like I've learned so much from a lot of the chats as well as from the presenters and just the practical challenges people are dealing with. And not just for this year, we always have this challenge of, do we need to report very early or do we need to wait for some hand scoring items to come in, for example? If a state, my earlier example, if the state is going to try to run a summer camp to really address some of the learning losses, it's going to really impact how quickly we have to turn over the results, and we may not be able to have the entire test results back yet. So what do you do in those situations? It's always a balance. And I think what we want to do is to evaluate the situation, think about the potential uses, and think about what are some of the other factors and come up with a solution. Again, this year is so unique and so challenging. I think it's good for us to have a lot of open dialogues and then figure out things together and be able to really figure out different ways to address these challenges and be in this together. So thanks.
Thanks. Well, I want to thank all of the panelists who participated today and everyone for joining us this week. To give you just a couple of quick plugs here before we wrap up, join us here next week, same time, same Zoom link. We'll be talking about interim assessments. And so another great panel lined up for that discussion. I hope you can join us. And then one more thing, so make sure you save the date for NCME's annual conference. This will be virtual, hopefully a great experience and more learning to be had. We'll be opening registration soon, but you should have those dates saved on your calendar. So thank you, everyone. This recording will be available soon on the NCME YouTube channel. And thank you again to the panelists.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.